What is the good? What do we mean by virtue and vice? Are these duties we owe to ourselves, to our community, or to our God? It's got to do with a social contract. But is that social contract one that absolutely depends on the fact that everyone kind of thinks the same thing? Are there consonances? Are we looking at a totally separate tradition? Are there lines of influence?
Jesus said, I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved. But no one can carry his sin into heaven. Those who will not forsake their sin cannot enter heaven's door.
By virtue ethics, I mean the philosophical subset of questions about how humans live well. Now, that begs a lot of questions as to what living well means, but it's fundamentally questions about action and about character in our human lives. Socrates says something groundbreaking, which is that human happiness, which everyone seems to want, this concept of eudaimonia, is virtue, and equally virtue is complete happiness. Simply knowing what virtue is brings you complete happiness. Why? Because for Socrates, you can't knowingly do bad. And if you know the full picture of what virtue looks like, you will necessarily do and be virtuous things.
Between the time when parents yield their control over their children's minds and the time the community takes over, the peer group is of extreme importance.
For Plato, he accepts that virtue is happiness, but he sees that the picture is much more complex than that. So there are four canonical virtues for Plato, and these remain throughout the Greek tradition in other schools of thought as well. There's the virtue of active wisdom, which is not just being wise, but actually knowing how to act. That's phronesis. There's the virtue of being able to control your own natural desires. That's temperance, or the Greek word sophrosyner. There's bravery, which also includes courage, fortitude, resilience, in the Greek term andreia. And then there's probably the most important of these, because it somehow stitches them together. There's the virtue of justice, dikaiosune. And for Plato, it's a balancing act of the different parts of our soul, which he thought were three in number, and each of them had an attendant virtue with justice uniting them together. There's no question at all that Plato is a dualist. We have a physical mortal body which will come to an end, but our soul is immaterial and immortal. For Plato, virtue is happiness, but for Aristotle, happiness is the ultimate goal. Everything we do, if we asked ourselves why, would end up being in order to be happy, and virtues as well are simply a means towards that happiness. There are various, I would say, New Testament virtues which come into play through the Christian tradition, which simply either aren't there as virtues beforehand, or the concepts aren't even understood. And that creates the space for a completely different development and evolution of morality, from it being an elite thing that the intellectuals attempt to practice, to being something that every human born into sin in the Christian thinking is equally free to partake in. Vice is a defect. Vice is not an act, it's not a sin, it's an internal state of something being wrong. For Plato, that would mean not being able to control your bad desires or the scale in which they manifest. For Aristotle, he has a much more famous and influential idea, which is the idea of the golden mean. The virtue stands at the middle of a vice of excess and of a vice of deficiency. So if you take a virtue such as bravery, there's an excessive vice to that, namely foolhardy recklessness, and there's a vice of deficiency, namely being a coward and doing nothing when you need to.
The paradox of Christianity is that Christianity at the same time emphasizes individuality to an extent, I think, that we don't find in the classical thoughts. But on the other hand, Christianity emphasizes community even to a greater degree than classical authors. You know, the idea of the church, that the Christ, it's Christ's body. So we are not saved alone. We are saved in this community, but at the same time, everyone is responsible for his own sin. For instance, the argument that is made often in modernity, that, I shouldn't restrain my natural inclinations. I mean, both for Augustine and for Aquinas and for, I guess, the majority of educated people until recently, those are not natural inclinations. We live in a state, we are sick for them. We are ill. And if you are ill, I don't know, the food, you don't like the food, the tasty food. You may have all sorts of feelings and desires which a healthy person wouldn't have. So that's a harsh truth to modern man. But what we call our natural desires, they are not natural from this broader Christian perspective. And some of them are natural and some of them are unnatural. So the whole point of the law, of the moral law, of the state law and the church law is to help people sort of to distinguish what is according to this rational order and what is not. But today, of course, everyone believes it's up to for us to decide. Dante takes the tradition of the seven deadly sins into his Divine Comedy, the beginning of the 14th century, and he describes purgatory as a mountain consisting of 7 terraces. If you see the hierarchy, it's exactly the hierarchy of this tradition. Lust is the least grave of all sins. It's very near to the paradise at the top. Those who committed sins connected to lust, he calls them those who departed from our life because of love. So lust is the least grave of sins because it's connected to love and to relationships. But the worst sin is pride. Pride is this cold self-isolation.
The rejection of the Catholic understanding of the role of good works or deeds in salvation is, you can say, the hallmark of Martin Luther's most influential protest. If deeds are unimportant for our eternal good, they also logically lack significance for eternal damnation. This paves the way for a new kind of Christian moral theological thinking. Bad actions will not threaten my salvation if I fundamentally have opted for Christ in my heart, as it were. faith is confirmed as a pure spiritual act of the mind. A way is paved for a religious blessing of an individualistic understanding of good and bad.
Be saved by God, I can squeeze myself through the needle side. I hope that I'll be saved by God, so I can accompany everyone I love.
I think the main point is really the idea of taking apart the thought that our morality has a transcendent source, and in that sense a kind of transcendent footing, that there is a legitimacy, in a kind of metaphysical legitimacy. If you take that apart, you have a kind of naturalism. So you no longer believe that what presumably Plato and the Christian church fathers believed to be a divinely rooted morality, that this is a myth. And once you see that as a myth and a kind of founding myth, then you have the next step in his argument, which for him is very important, namely that if it is the case that the value system under which we live is based on a metaphysical premise, which ultimately is untenable, then gradually you will find that the whole structure of value will become weaker and weaker, and at one point it will collapse, and it will reveal a world where there are no values. And this is what he speaks of as the development of nihilism.
Linear time justifies this modern obsession with change for its own sake, and is based on nihilism in the sense that the line stretches to an unknown future in one direction and an unknowable past in the other.
On the one hand, there's a view that human nature is sociable and ultimately benevolent. The other term in the argument was called self-love or interest. We would say self-interest. And that was the view that people were motivated first and foremost by the search for their own good, without any particular reference to society, without any need for fellow feeling. The founding fathers of the United States imagined their political system as, quote, a machine that would go by itself. Kant says that a well-constructed political system will work by itself no matter what are the virtues or vices of the people running it. He says that a good political system will work for a nation of devils, provided the devils are intelligent enough to understand their own interest. Commercial society requires the individual to pursue their own desires, their own interests. And that actually sustains society. Following my own desires, spending money on what I want, supports the economy. So that thrift, for example, parsimony, are no longer virtues, but actually vices. Now, Bernard Mandeville, although he was nicknamed Man-Devil, the idea that, as he put it, private vices are public benefits became current throughout the century to sell, for example, spirits, no matter how much damage they may do to individuals. Or nowadays, these arguments would support the tobacco industry. This has the further consequence that if you pursue that, the concept of virtue and of vice loses its meaning.
There was a type of ethics that became extremely important, where you really didn't need God anymore. The fact that you create a social contract means that there is a deficiency. You need to do something about the fact that people need to cooperate. They need to be able to trust each other. If we put it in economic terms, if you want to bring down transaction costs in society, you need to make people think more or less the same about a number of certain things, about, for example, interpersonal trust. Because because then you can pursue projects and you can make investments much faster, and you can also keep the society together and be able to rely on the fact that people understand what you say when there's a new law or if there's a new goal or a new policy or something like that. So we need our contracts, but they can also be, there is a danger here also that that society becomes too homogenized.
Things might be changing, but we're still the same.
We are so used to cooperating here and being trained at moving in the same direction. So if you look at how teachers, journalists, politicians speak about democracy, it seems as if there is an underlying thought saying that the goal of democracy is to make us agree and agree on the same goals, right? But the point with democracy is that we are not supposed to agree. We should be able to cooperate. We should be able to trade. We should be able to negotiate. But it does not mean that we need to think all the same, right? But that's an authoritarian thought.
It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. Oh, in the name of God. Now I know what it feels like to be God.
If you should sort of try to describe the transhumanist project, what it's all about, it's actually about making human existence better in all conceivable ways. Smarter, faster, stronger.
I want to reach out to this technology. I want to incorporate this technology into my art and have the two mixed together.
No longer is the idea of a pill that can raise the level of human intelligence merely the fantasy of science fiction. Researchers everywhere.
But ultimately then also trying to defeat death through the use of scientific technologies. That makes the project of transhumanism a kind of hubris in the sense that you try to become more godlike because the gods are, well, at least they live longer than us. and in many religious traditions, they live for eternity. The kind of ultimate wrong with human existence, according to the transhumanists, is that we have to die.
I think the Western world is so deeply embedded in an idea that God tells you what is good and bad, and God tells you what is right and wrong, and there's a kind of a commandment structure to our idea of virtue and of vice. You know, we have a clear picture of what it is that's good and what we're supposed to do. And once you have to think about good social behavior as just a product of having a society, a community, and a governance structure, you get people in India thinking in very similar ways, actually, about what it is to not prioritize your ego and desires over other people's well-being. So those ideas actually come up on both sides. And in India, that's associated with the notion of dharma, becomes a very important core theme for the Indian world. Once India understands that dharma is useful, but that doesn't tell us what is the good to become as a person, what is your ideal to move forwards, they get to say, well, wait, there isn't one. There are many ideals. There are different goods for humankind. And I think that the gods, as they develop throughout the early medieval period in a series of texts called the Puranas, kind of mythic texts, they get to unpack the plurality of virtues all expressed through these very different deities. Kali, who completely freaked out Westerners when they first arrive in India, she says what you have to do is understand the darkness of the world. If you understand it, if you can get your hands dirty, if you can see it and not be destroyed, if you can accept death, the one thing that no one can accept, you become strong, you become virtuous, you become knowing and robust in a way that is holistic. And in a way, I think that translates over into the secular picture. You know, we all know what goodness is. We know pleasure, we know pain. These things are obvious. But if you look around the rest of the world, if you look at not only at South Asia, but Southeast Asia, East Asia, the sense of what is good and what is right is much more complex. The sense of good and evil is not there in quite as simple a way. They acknowledge that human life involves situations where to do good is messy. You may have to be tough, or you may have to suffer or even cause suffering. To do bad is messy. You may do bad for good reasons. So that I think when you come out of this kind of God-given virtue model, you get into what we in philosophy might call kind of value pluralism, context ethics, understanding according to circumstance the many ways we can go forward towards different kinds of good and bad. That can seem confusing to the West, that it's not simple, but it can also seem much more adult, much more mature, much more complex, humane and humanistic in a way.
Here, a colony of honeypot ants is in a territorial conflict with a neighboring colony. None of these creatures can really choose to solve their conflict in any other way. Ants aren't political, nor do they create codes of behavior. But unlike ants, we are free to choose, and we are political and ethical animals as a consequence.
I think we ignore the fact that we are evolved creatures, that we are a product of natural processes of mutation and selection and inheritance. We ignore that at our peril. Evolutionary theory, it's not that old, right? It's like 170 years old. And of course, it was always met with resistance. And part of the resistance was, I think, normatively, morally motivated, because people thought that it paints this bleak picture of the world, and it paints this very, very grim and unforgiving picture of what life is like. One big thought was that if it's really true that we have this struggle for survival, and it's all about competition and about nature, red in tooth and claw, and just ruthlessness gets you ahead. If that's what shapes species, and if that's what life is about, you couldn't possibly have anything noble or altruistic or hopeful. You couldn't have any ideals. You couldn't have self-sacrifice. You couldn't have just even basic kindness. We have a kind of new ability that consists in this scaling up of morality that allows us to interact not just in these small groups that we evolved in, surrounded only by people that we know intensely well and that are related to us, but we can interact with strangers all over the world in productive ways, either economically or academically or scientifically or politically. So here you see a co-evolution between cultural techniques and how these create then the kind of niche in which the rest of our biological evolution happens. And once we have that, we can also have cultural diversity. We can have different styles of dress. And we can also have different norms. We can have different rituals for initiation. different expectations for who gets to eat what, different gender roles, and that is the kind of world that we still live in today, one with intense plasticity and flexibility and an enormous amount of an enormously rich cultural heritage that we have become utterly dependent on.